the role of Africa in addressing remote work post-COVID-19, the UN Sustainable Development Goal of economic growth. I'm delighted and happy to have in my midst wonderful jurists, lawyers, professors, legal minds who continue to raise the bar in the legal profession. To kickstart this webinar is the keynote speaker, Professor Damilola Olawiyi. Professor Damilola Olawiyi is a professor of law and Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic, Research, Innovation, and Strategic Partnerships. Also the Director of Institute for Oil, Gas, Energy, Environment, and Sustainable Development at the Ado-Ekiti University, Nigeria. His recent book publications include Effective Industry Law in Africa and the Human Rights-Based Approach to Carbon Finance. His topic is the effective implementation of the SDGs in Africa post-COVID-19, the role of strong institutions. My pleasure to welcome Professor Damilola Olawiyi.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to share my slide now. If you can enable me to be able to do that, that would be great. Thank you so much. While I wait for that, I should say how delighted I am to be with you, Ijeoma, and congratulations to Mohammed on his recent election as co-chair. When you have a relative that is doing well, you like to show off and tell the whole world you know them. And for the AIG, I like to say that I was one of the immediate past co-chairs, and now I can boast about that because the group is doing very well. So congratulations for keeping the flag flying and even for going beyond, above and beyond what we were able to do in the very recent past. And I hope that the innovation behind this idea of having this seminar series will illuminate the very best of what Africa can do to move further and take its place as one of the leading continents when it comes to the application and implementation of international law. And I think what we're talking about today is very topical and important given the events that the world is living through. Let's see if I can. Okay. In terms of I hope you can see my slides now. Yes, and I'll be talking about the effective implementation of SDGs in Africa, the role of strong institutions. And as I was saying, this is a very important topic, given the pandemic, its effect on trade, on commerce, and on the economies of many parts of the world, especially the already vulnerable economies. And we will see how those already vulnerable economies can now gather themselves up and begin to take steps that will lead them to not collapsing under the weight of this very invisible enemy that the world is fighting against. So I will, after this introduction, I will talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of where we were in Africa prior to the pandemic, and what the pandemic has done in terms of whether further stifling our ability to respond. And then I would begin to talk about the role of strong and effective institutions in responding. Everyone has focused their response to the pandemic mainly as remote work. Of course, that is one of the elements of the response, but I will emphasize here today that that is just one element. There are other elements that will be part of that strong institutional response that we all need. So I'll talk a little bit about the SDGs. Of course, they are aspirational goals that since 2015 have shaped, countries of the world have come together to say, well, over the next 15 years, by the year 2030, we hope to make progress in these goals and achieve some of these developmental aspirations. And the whole aim is to ensure that by the year 2030, some of the most pressing challenges facing the world would have been addressed. Of course, the problems divide themselves very neatly into three: the social problems, the economic problems, and the environmental problems. And this follows the path of previous work done on SDGs and on sustainable development in the past. Ever since that report by the Brundtland Commission, we've all thought of the sustainable development as development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And those three pillars have been important. And since at that time, the whole world has been trying to ensure that we make progress on all three pillars without leaving one behind. Prior to the SDGs, we had the MDGs that were meant to get us there by the year 2015, which of course we are still far away from getting there. And now we have the SDGs that will get us all there by the year 2030. And like I mentioned, the SDGs provide a framework for tackling some of the fierce and invisible enemies facing the world: poverty, hunger, climate change, political instability, corruption, financial crime. There is something in it for each of these problems. There is something in the SDGs for each of these problems. And of course, COVID-19 has become the most recent problem facing the world, the most recent invisible enemy facing the world. The SDGs already contain robust statements on health, on addressing diseases, but I think no one expected that the pandemic would shut down economic, social, and all aspects of development down at the same time. And that is why it is a very fierce challenge that, the question now is, how can we respond? And how will the SDGs lead us to responding in a coherent manner? Of course, prior to the pandemic, Africa already had its own pre-existing conditions. The truth is that Africa was already, as a continent, was not on track to achieve the SDGs due to pre-existing challenges that are known to all of us: endemic poverty, weak governance, systemic corruption, environmental pollution, unreliable power supply, as well as human rights problems. Again, even poor technological advancement and the likes were already issues that African countries were struggling to deal with. Now, we all know the statistics that for, more than 600 million people in Africa live without electricity, for example, while a lot more rely on non-commercial fuels for heating. There are challenges relating to development, stunted economic growth in many parts of Africa. So many African countries were already trying to deal with these problems. And they were already, before the pandemic, there were signs of progress. There were signs of progress. For example, there were important gains in infrastructure. There were important gains being made in technology as well. You had new forms of phone-based money transfer payments springing up in Kenya, for example, the M-Pesa and the like. So Africa was already on track, not on track of achieving the SDGs, but already making progress in terms of one key progress made is that at least there's a realization that there was a problem and there were genuine attempts, genuine efforts to address those problems. For example, in the infrastructure sector, a lot of African countries have increasingly announced infrastructure expansion programs that were supposed to get them, at least the target or the aim was to reduce the gap as much as possible. Of course, we've also seen progress in terms of regional economic integration. Prior to the pandemic, there was huge hope that the after African continental trade area agreement was meant to sort of boost regional harmonization across the continent. And studies show that by the year 2040, the agreement was meant to boost trade by as much as 25%. But again, what we have seen is that just like the story of the continent, whenever there is any form of renewed optimism, then something comes in the wheel of progress. And I think that is exactly what this pandemic has done. the pandemic has definitely slowed down progress in all of these areas I've talked about, whether it is infrastructure projects, whether it is in social development. And not only has it slowed down progress, it has also revealed how far behind we are in terms of, the SDGs. For example, countries without strong healthcare infrastructure have basically collapsed under the weight of the pandemic. Disaster response, resilience planning, education. In education, it's been a disaster, and for example, in Nigeria, for example, many of the universities they've had to shut down. There's nothing going on. Only private universities like Abdul have been able to continue to operate. So the pandemic has shown that due to many years of stunted growth and lack of sustained progress, the pandemic has revealed the true state and the lack of the low levels of technological advancement in many parts of the continent. Also, with almost near zero capacity for online dispute resolution, a lot of courts across the continent have struggled to continue with dispute resolution. For example, in Nigeria, for many months, it was even debated whether using online dispute resolution was constitutional. Which I thought that was very absurd because, anyway, I would not continue along that path, but I would say that it was a debate that was unnecessary in the first place, especially with the whole world struggling to keep justice delivery going. Of course, now there is a little bit of progress in terms of now the courts were able to say, yes, it's constitutional, so let's start. But saying let's start further then revealed how unprepared the system was to cope with the rigors of online dispute resolution due to a lot of technological gaps and the likes. So, and of course, the result is that over the last few months, we've seen a spike in criminality, domestic violence, even suicide rates in many parts of the continent. For example, just last week, we heard about the terrorist attack by the Boko Haram sect in Cameroon. There've also been increased criminality and attacks in Borno in Nigeria. So you've seen a spike in criminality, and you can trace all of that to slow response, number one. Number two, you can trace it to the fact that a lot of stakeholder community engagement initiatives that were ongoing in these conflict zones had to be altered. And of course, the result is spike in criminality. I've been directly affected by this because prior to the pandemic, I was leading a World Bank project in Nigeria that was meant to address some of this conflict in the oil and gas producing areas. But since this pandemic, we've had to stop it. We've had to stop everything. We've had to stop the negotiations. We've had to stop the capacity development plans we had for the militants. And of course, I wasn't too shocked to hear that some of them are already dusting off their tools to resume militancy. So the pandemic has altered our progress. And I developed this chart so you can have an idea of where we were prior to the pandemic and how the pandemic has affected progress more. You see that under the economic pillar, you have SDG number 1, no poverty, zero hunger, decent work, economic growth, and the likes. And when you want to look at the state of many African countries, you can easily look to their GDP as well as, and you see that, you have countries like Qatar with 0% poverty and with a GDP of 68,000, US 2% poverty, 62,000 GDP, Canada 46,000 and 0.7% poverty and 0.7 in England as well. But when you go to Africa, you see Nigeria at 92% poverty rate, and Nigeria was recently tagged as the poverty capital of the world because of that. You see Ghana at 56.9 and Kenya at 86.5. So prior to the pandemic, these were the pre-existing problems. Now, as the pandemic helped, no, it has not, because due to revenue loss, liquidity stress, recession, job loss, unemployment, some of these figures are going further down, and you've seen a rise in illicit financial flow, internet fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, criminal smuggling, and the likes. So the economic indicators were bad prior to the pandemic. And when you look at the COVID challenges, you see that unless something drastic is done, it might become a humanitarian crisis for many African countries. When you look at the social pillar, you see SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 4 quality education, SDG 5 on gender equality and the likes. And when you look at the Human Development Index, which again is one of the ways to measure the social progress of a country, whether you're talking about life expectancy, life satisfaction, happiness, electrification rates, you see that normally with the HDI, a country with 0.8 and above is doing very well. A country with 0.7 is high, and low is below 0.55. When you look at Canada, you see life expectancy of 82 years, 0.9 in terms of HDI, which is very high. In the UK, 81 years life expectancy, 0.9 HDI. Qatar, 80 years life expectancy, 0.8 HDI. And in the United States, 0.9 HDI, 79 years life expectancy. And when you look at Africa, and these are some of the strong performers in Africa, I must say, and you see that, you know, the life expectancy in Kenya is 65 years, Ghana, 63 years, Nigeria, 53 years, Morocco, 76 years. So the challenges were there, right? And COVID has added another layer to these challenges in terms of the SDGs. Higher mortality rates due to the pandemic. Due to the loss of recreational facilities, there's been a spike in depression. There's been a spike in insecurity, as I mentioned, higher rates of domestic abuse. We've seen a lot of videos circulating of entrenched problems of domestic abuse, which have now been heightened due to the lockdown. We've seen strained healthcare system, vulnerability of cities and the likes. And you've seen a spike in suicide rates due to distress and fear of contagion and the likes. So the problem was there, but now the pandemic creates another layer of social development challenges. On the environmental path, you see the SDGs, SDG 6, SDG 12, SDG 13 on climate change and the likes. And again, when you look at the water quality and sanitation index, you see another you see another layer of challenges. This figures show that 98%, there's 98% of water quality and sanitation in Canada, 95 in the UK, 95 in the US. But again, when you look at Nigeria, you see 7.7%, Kenya 0.63, and the likes. And recently, I know Nigeria was pointed out as one of the countries with the highest defecation rates in the world due to poor water quality and sanitation. Drop in airport, of course, the COVID challenges have heightened some of these problems again. I have been involved in a litigation recently in which we've seen a rise in poaching due to the fact that many of the parks have had to shut down due to the pandemic. You've seen a reversal of environmental programs. Now, all these things are not to say that Africa is not making progress. But like I say, the real challenge for African countries right now is beyond the SDGs. It is more of even bridging the gap, the SDG gap. There is just such a huge gap that needs to be addressed. And with the pandemic, without early and holistic policy response, like I said, chances are that the pandemic might quickly morph into socioeconomic, humanitarian, and political crisis in Africa. And it could widen the already huge gap that many African countries were trying desperately to bridge. For example, the current government in Nigeria has initiated a number of programs meant to bridge some of these gaps. But I would say that post-pandemic, some of those efforts now have to be doubled, if we don't want to have a situation of humanitarian crisis, especially in conflict-prone zones. So without strong and supportive institutions, progress might be very impossible. For example, strong and legal institutions are required in any form of progress that a society is trying to make, whether you're trying to attract FDIs, whether you're trying to develop new infrastructure to address some of those SDG gaps, whether you're trying to ensure that schools are not shut down due to the pandemic, all of this would require strong institutions. Whether you're trying to address corruption, you cannot address corruption without strong institutions. And I always say African countries we like to, philosophize and think about the strong leader, the strong mayor in town who would solve all the problems in one day. But the experiences of many African countries show that you don't need a strong emperor in town, you need a strong institution. Because many of the countries that are doing well today in the world have strong institutions, and it doesn't really matter. It's just like some of the strong football teams that we love to watch. Some of them are so good that I can coach them because they are so good. They have the structure in place. Not that I plan to drop my legal career anytime soon. But when you look at the World Bank's Doing Business Index, for example, it highlights what countries are looking for when they want to invest in a country. So, simplified processes. And I've put some of this in bold because you will see that everything in bold, and you would agree with me, they all talk about almost, internet technology. Whether you're talking about simplified process, how can you have a simplified process without online access? Whether you're talking about open, predictable, and business-friendly legislation, it will be open if it is accessible online. These are business requirements before the pandemic, but now the pandemic has even shown that without strong institutions that are technologically driven, it will be difficult for many African countries to bridge the SDG gaps. Tax incentives, flexible entry, access to fair and timely dispute resolution. These are the things countries are looking for. Enhanced legal framework for technology transfer, simplified labor, strong and transparent PPP regulations, understanding IP issues, reduce legal. These are the ingredients, and these are the determinants of the flow of FDIs. Now, all of the highlighted indicators require strong, effective, innovative, and technology-driven institutions. Without addressing the old developmental challenges of poor infrastructure, skill deficit, technological backwardness, it will be very, very difficult for African countries to bridge the gap. The pandemic has even stated, has underlined this further. It provides an opportunity for African countries to reset their laws, to sort of adjust to the emerging realities in the post-pandemic workplace. So in terms of the three lessons, for African countries to thrive in the new normal, I do think three main things are required. Number one is remote access. In a recent survey, close to 75% of the CFOs, the chief financial officers, and leaders, executive leaders interviewed show that they are about to shift their company's employees to remote working. Doing business post-COVID will require remote access to business registration, e-commerce, procurement, filing, digitization of law practice, online dispute resolution, and the likes. So, and when you look at Africa, there is the World Economic Forum recently released the Work from Home Feasibility Index, and it shows that many African countries are not even ready for work from home. When we talk about work from home, we all think about the big cities, but what about the peasants or the farmers or the low-income secretarial staff that does not live in the main city, that lives in the rural communities? I know because some of the work I do, they are very close to those communities, in which when you talk of internet and remote connection, it's like, what are you even saying? So it will be very difficult to telework in almost all African countries, especially in the rural areas where there is, where they don't even have computers at home, or they talk less of a tablet. They don't even have there's high cost of internet access. They don't even have electricity and the like. So it will be very difficult to talk about remote work in those contexts. Number two that I want to identify is interoperability. That is the ability of institutions to function as one. The ability to share resources as one. You see that one of the biggest challenges in many African countries is the tendency of institutions to function independently of one another. If you want this, go to the Ministry of Works. If you want that, go to the Ministry of Water, or go to the Ministry of Happiness, as some countries now have. So without tying all these loose ends together, it will be difficult. to achieve interoperability. And the OECD report recently shows that lack of interoperability is one of the key reasons why the pandemic has hit a lot of countries so hard. A third one that I will like, and I suggest there is a need for one institution approach, open information exchange architecture. The last one, of course, is the need for innovative and responsive laws. With increased remote access, there is now a need for dispute resolution institutions to now shift and create opportunities for to modernize legal systems to ensure that they're able to meet the demands of resolving dispute online. For example, you have in Ireland and Netherlands and in the UK, they've introduced online courts to deal with small claims. They've now introduced what they call e-justice system, in which, and very recently, you had a UK High Court trial, which was conducted in a virtual courtroom and was streamed live on the YouTube platform, following the UK Coronavirus Act, which allowed them to do that. This is the sort of innovation that we need across the continent in terms of delivering e-justice. Of course, to be able to achieve that, there will be a need to update court rules to allow giving evidence via video conferencing, swearing in of witnesses, distant participation, streaming on YouTube, for example, was in order to meet the requirement of public hearing. It has to be public. It has to be available for. So, and so setting up this video infrastructure, and of course, before you can do this, you have to dismantle legal provisions that tend to say everything must be in person, and those constitutional arguments have to be dismantled so that you'd allow e-justice. So, well, the conclusion is that building strong, effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions has to be the basis and foundation of all post-COVID recovery plans, whether we're talking of economic planning, research, legislation, and rulemaking. Without addressing many of those old developmental challenges that make technology difficult, it will be very, very difficult for African countries to thrive post-pandemic. I think there is a need for us to focus seriously on a mix of structural and non-structural reforms. While the structural reforms will include designing, constructing, and upgrading current infrastructure in order to provide for telework, e-commerce, and e-justice, the most important and the non-structural measures would include putting in place laws that to promote and encourage telework, e-commerce, e-justice. And I look forward to the contributions of the panelists as we talk about telework, e-commerce, and e-justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lawi. Thanks for that. Really informative. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. It's my pleasure and privilege to be introducing our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Sophie Williams-Elebe. She is a professor and head of the Department of Mercantile Law and the Deputy Director of the African Procurement Law Unit at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She is a highly regarded expert on issues such as public procurement, anti-corruption, and development law. She has also published several books, the latest of which is entitled Public Procurement Regulation in Africa, Development in Uncertain Times, published by LexisNexis in 2020. She's also published Public Procurement Regulation, the 21st Century Africa in 2018. And in 2012, she published Fighting Corruption in Public Procurement with Hart Publishing in 2012. She is a proud holder of a PhD in Public Procurement and Anti-Corruption from the University of Nottingham in England. And she's also taught in several other universities, including in Nottingham, Lagos, and Stirling. So without further ado, Professor Williams-Elebe, over to you.
Thank you everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about remote learning for Africans, bridging the digital infrastructure gap. So of course, the pandemic has brought to the fore a lot of shortcomings in Africa, especially in relation to digitalization in education. So whilst many countries in the global north were able to transition to emergency remote learning, with few obstacles, if you like. Many African educational institutions have struggled. And in some countries, and I think Babalola already said this, learning in public sector, primary, secondary, and tertiary education institutions has come to a complete halt. And so we have now a divide between privately funded and publicly funded institutions, in which the privately funded ones have continued learning. And this is just going to widen the inequalities and the wealth gap in these countries in the future. So I'm going to be talking about some of the steps needed to bridge this gap in African countries in relation to education systems. So what do we mean by the digital gap? And a definition for it has been given by Shenglin and some other authors as the gap in usage and access to digital infrastructure and services between individuals, households, businesses, or geographical areas. So the digital gap is wider between African countries and many other countries. And then again, we have some specific aspects of the gap that are peculiar to Africa. So some of these challenges that are peculiar to Africa are the lack of access to digital infrastructure. And by that, I mean lack of access to the internet, especially in rural, remote, or disadvantaged or underserved areas in some African countries. So poor connectivity or no connectivity at all. We also struggle with the issue of affordability of devices and data, digital services. Of course, in many African countries are importers of digital devices, and that means that some of those price points are a bit difficult. Apart from the lack of access and affordability, we also have the challenge of inadequate skills to actually benefit fully from digital technologies, and then issues with inequality of outcomes, especially when you talk about new technologies such as AI and blockchain and such like. So that's basically some of the issues that Africa is facing generally in relation to digitalization. In relation to education, we have further problems. Now, Professor Francis Wang, who is the president of the International Association of Law Schools, made a comment recently about the pandemic. And I'll just quote him. He says that we are coming to the realization that this is a transformative event. There is no way back. We must focus on what lies ahead. This shift has challenged some basic assumptions on how we teach and how our students learn. Worldwide, all formal education became remote. Schools had to go virtual. Some succeeded, some struggled, and a few simply stopped. Now, in Africa, we have a lot of those countries that simply stopped. Between April and June of 2020, the International Association of Law Schools actually sent out a survey to law students from undergraduate to postgraduate to try and assess their experience with going remote. And so this association obviously is the International Association of Law Schools rather, and they have membership from law schools all over the world. And it was very instructive to actually see the discrepancies between student experiences in Africa and in other continents. So in Africa, 49% of students, so these are law students, undergraduate to postgraduates, as I said, 49% of these students indicated that since their schools went online, or since we switched to remote learning, the quality of their education has worsened, which is basically half of the students, which is quite quite a sad statistic. In Africa, the biggest issues that students are facing, so the technical issues are the low bandwidth, the lack of online skills, and the lack of support, of technical supports when they've gone online. In Africa, we've also struggled to have synchronous learning, and that's primarily because of things to do with connectivity, the low bandwidth I mentioned earlier, reliability, and cost of internet services and data. So for instance, in my university, we've had to basically do away with synchronous learning because students struggle with connectivity, even though we've been able to have zero-rated websites for our educational platforms. But of course, connectivity at home is a different issue. And then of course, there's the issue of electricity outages as well. Another statistic that came out of this survey was the fact that in Africa, 63% of students want to return to face-to-face teaching, compared with 44% of European students. So of course, you can see that the majority of African students are struggling to be at home. So in Africa, many universities, public universities, have stopped teaching completely since 2020. So Babalola already mentioned Nigeria public universities are not teaching at all. So if there's any learning going on, it's all self-study by the students. In Uganda, it's also a very similar story. There's no there's no remote teaching, there's no online learning going on for public universities. So what are the implications of this? Of course, I mentioned already that this is going to increase the inequalities and the wealth gap between wealthier Africans and those who are attending public universities, and also will increase the inequalities between African graduates and others in future. We're likely to see higher dropout rates. Now, if students are home from March until whenever the universities resume, there are going to be some, because of loss of earnings, loss of family earnings, are going to drop out. And I think that's going to have a direct impact, especially on female education and agency. And that will undermine SDG 4.5 on gender disparities in education, and SDG 8.6 on the proportion of youth that should be in education or employment. And then the other thing I think, which is probably a little bit more worrisome, is that what would be the impact of this on students who are in sectors such as in medicine or studying medicine, or other health sciences. If you've been out of school for 9 months or a year and then you go back, what implication will that have, or what impact will that have on your lifelong learning? I think on the positive side, and I'm seeing this a little bit in South Africa, is a lot of students have had to find ways to have started basically small businesses to try to contribute to the family income. So we are seeing increased youth entrepreneurship on a limited scale. So given all these challenges, how do we actually address this issue? I think that one of the things that governments in Africa need to do is to really recognize and accept that access to digital infrastructure is a human right. It's a public good, and it should be treated with the same the same importance as other sectors such as education, health, etc. So we have to have long-term strategies to provide schools with the infrastructure, the training, and the capacity needed for remote learning and blended learning in the future. So we have to really ensure that the current lack of access to digital infrastructure in rural areas, remote areas, or underserved areas have to be addressed, especially around the middle, the last, and the invisible mile in African countries. Also, affordability of devices and digital services. We must put in policies that will enable increased competition. And also in terms of skills, I mentioned that one of the things that African law students especially are struggling with is the fact that they don't actually have the skills to actually take advantage of these digital technologies, even in relation to remote learning. So we have to really include digital skills in the primary school curriculum. And then for adults, we have to have programs for the reskilling and upskilling of the workforce. In terms of outcomes, we have to address issues around ethics in digital decision-making to ensure that there's an equality of outcomes and that the use of technology is inclusive. And finally, I think at regional level, we need to have consensus on managing issues such as privacy, cybersecurity, censorship, etc. And that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sophie. I like what you said about digital skills needs to be upscaled. We have to talk about that in the Q&A session. The next speaker is Mr. Ose Okpeku. Mr. Ose Okpeku is a partner in one of the biggest law firms in Nigeria, the Law Crest LLP, where he leads the employment law, HR, and immigration practice team. He's also a member of the Energy and Projects team, and also a member of the SBL group of the Nigerian Bar Association. Also, he has led the HR integration process of significant mergers and acquisitions in the energy, finance, and FMCG sectors. He is regularly engaged by multinationals to assist in reviewing the HR policies and procedures, as well as developing functional employee engagement frameworks. Mr. Okpeku's topic is remote work in Africa, ILO decent work agenda, and the impact of SDGs.
Thank you, Ijeoma, for that introduction. For a moment, I couldn't recognize myself, but thank you very much for that. Fantastic presentation, Damilola and Shokwe Williams. Very a pleasure to be here to listen to everyone, and I'm quite impressed with the cross-pollination of ideas that have been thrown up, and some very interesting topics to discuss, to take further from here. And I'm sure that by the time we are through, there will be other platforms for us to take some of these ideas forward. So I'll be looking at decent work agenda, remote working, and its impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. And thereafter, I want to look at what we need to do post-COVID to kind of put a framework to some of these issues. So I'll start with looking at what is decent work agenda. The ILO defines decent work agenda as productive work for men and women under conditions of equity and human rights. Now, the decent work agenda was some policy that was started by ILO in 1999 and is based on 4 pillars, which is 1, fundamental rights at work, social dialogue, social policy, employment, and entrepreneurship creation. So by 2015, when the discussions on SDG were going on, it was then agreed that these 4 pillars will actually form part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look at SDG 8, it actually talks about decent work and sustainable employment. So to that extent, the decent work agenda has become part of the SDG goals as well. And so if we then move further down to look at remote working, I guess we all know what remote working is now. I think it's a topic that I don't think we've flogged it, but I think it's a topic that has been spoken so much about that I think everyone understands what remote working is. But the frightful thing is, and the recent research I was just carried out, it does show that it is less likely for poorer countries to have access to remote working. And when they meant poorer countries, obviously we're looking at African countries and developing countries, mostly in Africa. So chances are 22% of the workforce had access to remote working compared to the world average of about 38% or 58%, which is somewhat worrying. But then again, if you then understand, if you look back to look at the internet integration process or depth of internet access across the continent, Africa has a percentage of about 38% compared to the world average of about 58%. So that in itself will actually impact on remote working. But then, if you look at decent work, which impacts on SDG, and look at remote working has the capacity, if actually implemented properly, to actually eliminate, to actually help actualize one of the SDG goals, which is number 1, poverty. So if yes, how will I put it now? Remote working at the optimum, which leads to creation of extra jobs, it could actually lead to earning and end poverty, which is number 1 on the SDG goals. So to that extent, remote working is very critical. But then if you also look back and remember that in May, Africa signed up the AfCFTA, the AFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we expect that some of the first deals will come in January next year, all things being equal. It creates a whole vista of opportunity for everyone because people can definitely sit back in Nigeria and work in Kenya or work in South Africa or area, because now there's free movement of services, albeit virtually. But to now tie this all up, for me, the most critical thing, because I'm looking at it from an employment point of view, is to look at how remote working and decent work agenda impact on SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. I won't dwell on strong institutions anymore because Babalola has done justice to strong institutions, but I'll look at access to justice. And critically, one of the parameters of justice is the fact that justice delayed is justice denied. So prior to 2010, using Nigeria as an example, when the third alteration to the Constitution kind of liberated employment law issues, you could actually have a matter go through the court process for 10 years. So if as an employee, you do get a judgment after 10 years, time value of that judgment is actually worthless. So now with National Industrial Court, it's easier. You can actually get judgment in a year or two. That's fine. But now remote working, because again, judges are, if you look at it, they are also employees as well, and they can actually work remotely. If we have the infrastructure in place for them to work remotely, it means I can file my processes from anywhere. So my client doesn't need to travel distances because there's virtual hearing. And then this could actually hasten and fast track the process of justice. And so what you're then doing, you are even creating faster access track roads to justice. But however, all this being there, and we must then have to now look at what we need to do. And for me, we always look at structures, remote working, and then implement without looking at the contextual, our own contextual issues. So remote working in Africa, what do we need to do? One, we suffer from serious infrastructural deficit. Culturally, the way we see work is slightly different. And so prior to this time, remote working has been driven by issues around millennials, this disruption that technology and artificial intelligence has caused. But pandemic has actually made us realize that it's either you ship in or you ship out. So if you don't change and adapt, you'll probably shop out and short shop. So, but if we then go back and sit back a bit and look at it, the way we contextually as Africans do work is slightly different. Work is also some form of social interaction. So in the context of implementing remote working, we must also look at our contextual issues. So we struggle with infrastructural deficit. And I will give plaudits to Lagos State because recently Lagos State has started, in Nigeria, has started a process of broadband integration. So they are laying fiber cables across the Lagos State to make sure that everybody has access to internet, which is one of the recommendations that we should do going forward. But quite apart from that, for some people, work is a form of interaction. And so for me to even begin to talk about remote working, we need to first of all build a structural legal framework. So for instance, in 2002, the EU had a framework agreement for teleworking. So a lot of countries in the EU, based on that framework agreement, have developed domestic statutes around remote working. In 2010, the United States passed the Federal Telework Enhancement Act. So in these countries, you definitely have a legal framework for remote working, which makes it structured, which makes it sustainable, and which gives a legal impetus to people who want to engage in remote working. The truth be said, remote working has come to stay. So we must find a way contextually to make it work for us in Africa. So for me, some of the things we need to do firstly is to find a way to have some form of structural legal framework put in place. Because currently, as we speak, it's mainly contractual. And the only reason why it's worked so far is that most organizations have taken the line of social dialogue as exposed by the IIO. And to that extent, they've been able to contractually bind people to do home working because they get to survive. But going forward, what do we then need to do? It's one thing to then have the legal framework. The next thing is, do we have the infrastructural support to actualize this legal framework. So we need to then start thinking of, hold on, we might not have broadband, we might not have this, what else can we do to make sure that remote working actually works? And then we then have to also understand that not, because that's always the issue, it becomes a fad, everybody wants to do home remote working, but that is not every sector that can actually do remote working. Now we have a situation where majority of work in Nigeria, as an African country, is informal sector. So how many of such people can actually do remote working? Because whether you like it or not, a lot of remote working is done amongst knowledge-based economy and knowledge-based work. So really, we need to put all those into context, begin to think. So with a factory hand in the beer factory or in the production factory, be able to do remote working, no, that's not going to work. So how do we accommodate this? And so infrastructurally, we need to think about it. Structurally, in terms of the legal framework, we need to think about it. And then the health-wise, we need to also look at a very key issue that's arising, that's coming out from remote working. Because we are social beings in Africa, the seclusion of working from home is creating a major issue in mental health. And because we do not have a structured approach to dealing with mental health in Nigeria, it's a big problem. As I tell you, the only laws we have on mental health is the Lunacy Act of 1958, which only talks about sequestrating you or putting you in a mental home. I'm not talking about root cause issues. I'm looking at mental health as a continuum that has issues around depression, anxiety, panic attack, PTSD. Nobody addresses that. So you also have a situation where for some people, work was an escape from possibly domestic abuse or psychological abuse or emotional abuse. And then they have now had to start at home, working from home with the same person who's been abusing them. So you are creating another problem with mental illness. And so in trying to develop a remote working framework, we must look at the issues around the legal framework, technological infrastructure, and the social well-being, which talks about things like mental health and the total well-being of the individual, as well as work-life integration. And really, people are moving from work-life balance now to work-life integration, because work-life balance, we presuppose that there's a balance divide between work and life, when really there's really no balance divide. It's a way of integrating the process to make a wholesome, well-being human being. So, and I will stop it at here and wait for my other panelists to chip in on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ose Okpeku. Thanks for that insightful presentation. The next speaker is Professor Funmi Olonisikan. She's the Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at the King's College London. She founded the African Leadership Center and aims to build the next generation of African scholars and analysts, governing cutting-edge knowledge for peace, security, and development in Africa. Professor Olonisikan has positioned her work to serve as a bridge between academia and the worlds of policy and practice. Her most recent research has focused on reclaiming narratives of peace and state building in Africa. Her topic is what COVID-19 teaches us about building peaceful societies. You're welcome, Professor Olonisikan.
Thank you very much, Ijeoma. Really appreciate it. I think it was good to have listened to all the different speakers before me, because I want to look at how to add value to some of the very cogent points that have been made. The first point to be made is that I think it's important to revisit, and that has been alluded to revisit the structural roots of much of the points that have been made about why. The key point for me is, why are we at this particular juncture unable to transform the status quo? And why has it been possible for COVID-19, in a sense, to set us back as far back as we've heard our keynote speaker talk about, and others have reinforced that. And I think it requires that we go back to some of the basics that define the extent to which we're able to live in peaceful and sustainable societies. And in a sense, that complements Ose's point about, if you like, SDG Goal 16. Goal 16 in itself at the start seemed to me a bit of an add-on. It was the missing bit in the Millennium Development Goals. And finally, we have it. And I think there was much more we could have done. But even so, the strong statements that have been made around it can begin to allow us to ask a different set of questions. And therefore, the big argument to be made is that what COVID-19 did is to reveal the scale of the structural inequalities that prevent the possibility of positive peace. And positive and negative peace, I'm taking from Galton's notions of peace. The idea that the mere absence of violence is negative peace, and you need to go further to have the absence of structural violence in order to have positive peace. And I think, adding to that argument, what we had done, when you listen to Professor Damilola's keynotes, he talked a lot about how things were already bad before COVID. COVID makes them worse. And I think it's because we had been comfortable enough to be living to be keeping our institutions, just really hanging in the balance to help us maintain negative peace. I don't think the idea of positive peace is something that we were anywhere close to practicing in the first instance. So what COVID-19 did was to simply lay things bare. The hollowness of the kinds of institutions that we've been building. And I want to pose a question to us about whether actually it's a choice between institutions and leadership. And I take the point very much so that was made about this focus on strong leaders, because it cannot be about the focus on individuals who by themselves are going to suddenly make things better. That kind of leadership is not the panacea we're looking for. But what types of institutions? I therefore want to propose the notion of a deeper look at leadership infrastructure as a way of having a common conversation between, if you like, institutions and leadership. What do I mean by that? Because at the moment, what we see is a gap. There's a gaping hole actually between the kinds of institutions and structures and frameworks that we put on the ground, that therefore on any day you can see the leadership infrastructure. You can see the hardware of it. And so the idea that we have our presidencies, our courthouses, the technical aspects that will feed into all of this, looking good. I mean, if I go back to if I wear my previous UN hat for a moment, we did all of these things in war-affected countries and developing countries. We would say the laws have been implemented. But we have taken UN resolutions and tried to adopt them. And then you go into parliamentary processes that will showcase what was done. In New York, all of the heads of state will come and really take their time to elegantly sign all of the protocols that we had. And you would domesticate them, you would think. And people would say we did. So on paper, everything looks just neat enough to maintain that precarious balance that will not tip us into direct and physical violence, but actually does not take us to where we need to be. And I think that's why the whole question of examining the leadership infrastructure is important. So therefore, I separate that hardware that is about the institutions, that help us put a framework together to govern life in common. That's the hardware. And those who manage the hardware have become so skilled at ensuring that cases will be heard, that ministries would pass, that parliaments will pass the right kinds of if you like, the acts of parliament will be passed and would have just enough resources to tick us, keep things ticking. And government departments would do their share. But the software of it is the canker that we need to be dealing with. The relationship between the managers of the hardware and the rest of society. What is the quality of that relationship? If I have passed a bill that is supposed to make things better for me as a human being, as a woman, the gender dimensions of it, the class dimensions of it have been laid bare by COVID. Kenya, a good example, where at least, even Nigeria as well, but Kenya came up with all of this data about the number of teenage girls that have been pregnant since COVID-19. In one county alone, Machakos County, 4,000 have been pregnant. Girls of between ages of 11 and 19 have been pregnant since COVID. That says a lot about what happens in the domestic sphere, but in the private sphere where we have kept people locked down. And I think that's why societal mobilization has been as skewed as it has been. The story of societal mobilization is not just an African challenge, by the way. It's been laid bare more in some parts of Africa than in others. It's a global issue, so you can actually see how some rich countries have also shown serious weaknesses in their leadership infrastructure because the existing trust in society that should have kept the two married, tightly was not there. And what you therefore find is an alternative leadership infrastructure that is created because of the hollow state, the hardware that is not working, and therefore those who should be building relationships with that governance arrangement routinely go to another place to look for assistance. And that's why the relationship that is formed between non-state actors and citizens goes into these very devious areas where you have to, because lockdown therefore means a choice between, and we've seen it in some countries, they've said it physically, it's a choice between COVID-19 or hunger. And many have said we've chosen COVID-19 over hunger, we've chosen to go with COVID instead of being hungry. And that's why the Joakali workers on the streets of Kenya, the informal sector workers cannot be locked down. In any case, the places where they live, those places are not, it's not sustainable to live there. And the point's been made already by the previous panelists. And that's why I wanted to tease out this whole question of peace. What is it that COVID has taught us about what peaceful and sustainable societies ought to be? I think it's taught us that we have all this time focused on particular kinds of unhelpful leadership frameworks that will focus on individuals and so-called strong leaders. There's nothing so-called, and the point has been made. We have also focused on very, very hollow institutions and technical processes that have nothing to do with the relationships that ought to forge, if you like, a justice system that provides equal life chances. So far, the unequal life chances are so grave that we see the gender inequity, we see the class inequity, and therefore we can no longer reconcile them. The software is nowhere near being part of the hardware. And I think for me, those are the questions around positive and negative peace that we need to deal with, because unless we deal with the rebuilding of those relationships, we're just going to be piling more on the legal, technical, political, technical, the hardware element that will mean nothing to the vast majority of society, but we deliver justice a little bit for you and I. And I think I want to stop there. I just wanted to tease out that in a period of COVID, New Zealand, Germany, all these other countries that could, because the US is also really is a matter of degrees, not too different from some of our countries at the moment in terms of how they have managed COVID. And remote work might be one element that everyone is getting right, even middle class people in Africa, if you know, that divide is not there. You and I are on a different part of the divide. And so it's important that we think about the alternative leadership infrastructure that we have created, for good or bad, if we're going to think about the delivery of aspects of the SDGs in ways that would serve Africa well in the long run. So far, it's not. To my mind, the point has been made, but we need to correct that. And I think the COVID moment allows us to be able to correct it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lonisika. I like what you said about COVID has actually exposed lots of inefficiencies on the continent, which is so true. We'll see how we progress from here. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce our last speaker, but first I must say that this is the second time that I've heard Professor Olanisakin speak, and it's always such an inspiring, always such an inspiring speaker. So it's lovely to hear you speak again, Professor. So our final speaker is, I can tell you, a giant in the world of arbitration. He is Professor Mohammed Abdul Wahab. He is a founding partner and head of the international arbitration practice in Zulfikar Partners law firm. He's also an academic. He's the chair of private international law, and he's a professor of international arbitration in Cairo University. He is a vice president of the International Chamber of Commerce International Court of Arbitration, and has received far too many awards in the area of arbitration for me to list. So without further ado, over to him. Go ahead, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Hillel. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to join my esteemed colleague on this panel. It is quite a treat to have a diverse panel on a number of topics. Normally, we get too much caught up with our specific sectors that deny us the pleasure of hearing different perspectives regarding certain matters. So it's indeed a pleasure. And I think Professor Hillel has given me more credit than I deserve, but I will endeavor to keep up with the excellent presentations made by my colleagues. I did mention before we start that I'm speaking last, so I get to say I concur with all of them, which I do. Let me briefly say, of course, the enlightening keynote by Professor Babalola is great and much appreciated. The e-learning approach to things with the COVID by Professor Williams, also very much appreciated. I also enjoyed the aspects on remote working by Mr. Okpeku, and finally, Professors Olonisake and I could not agree more with Professor Hillel regarding the moving statements she made, especially the choice between COVID and hunger. I think this last statement has driven politicians across the globe, especially on the continent, to take measures different from what has been advised in terms of lockdown. No, states are not going to go into lockdown. At best, some curfews, strict measures, and then finally lifting everything so that the economy can move forward. What I intend to do is to address you on a more optimistic side of things. I am not an optimist myself, but I see a great opportunity for COVID-19 for Africa. And I will mention why in the next few minutes that I have before we open up the questions. My point today, and the title I've chosen, is that COVID-19 as a transformative catalyst for change, online justice systems, opportunities and prospects for Africa. I've written widely and addressed audience on African aspects for a number of years. And I think Africa has risen to the level that of global attention. Everyone now has a great interest in Africa, and it has been the case for years. And now it's the time whether Africans want to take the lead or enjoy the backseat ride that for generations we have enjoyed, unfortunately. But now is the time to take the lead. COVID-19 has been for the first few weeks, at least the first registered case on Africa, the known one, was on the 14th of February 2020, and it was in Egypt. And of course, since then, African states, no less than 52 countries have registered cases. But the first few weeks were what I call a clock stopper for state institutions. Everyone was hit by a wave that we thought maybe for Europe, the US, everyone was waiting for their turn. And when it showed up, it has resulted in a shutdown in the court system. So private justice through arbitration or other alternative means was the only option. And quite right, I have to say, and what I call it, the arbitration snowpiercer has managed to navigate its way and offer justice when courts have not managed to keep up, at least for the first few weeks, until courts had to adjust either by moving to an online platforms that were not ready or tested, pilot projects that were forced into. So in fact, COVID has catalyzed the process everyone was speaking out long before. So that was the showstopper or clock stopper in terms of the economy, at least for countries that went into a lockdown mode. In Egypt, for example, from day one, they realized that a lockdown mode is not an option. So we had curfews that have been subject to stringent and relaxed measures over the weeks until lifting everything finally end of July. Not because that there are zero cases, but because simply you're trying to contain the pandemic in a way which apparently cannot be contained in any country. And I think it's fair to say that we can expect a second wave coming either by the end of this month or the later on. But I mean, the second thing is the COVID frustration, what I call the incline, recline, and decline of the measures that we've seen, from lockdowns to curfews to precautionary measures to opening up despite the ongoing crisis, because it is a crisis. But amidst this crisis that has hit the continent and the globe at large, there are opportunities and lessons to be learned. And I think one of the foremost opportunities for Africa is that it has accelerated the digital transition. COVID-19 has shown that technology is neither a luxury nor an option. It is a requirement. If you want to do business, if you want to maintain either through e-learning on postgraduate, undergraduate levels, remote working through law firms, doing business and offering e-services, we have seen over the past few weeks an unprecedented increase in the number of e-services that are provided across the continent, despite the lack of readiness, the digital readiness by the continent in this respect. We have seen even new services servicing to the market that were not experienced before, more on selling of online clothes, offering different services, medical services online, of course the e-learning platforms, and I will use the words, the wise words that Professor Williams has mentioned in relation to some countries or schools and universities have embraced technology or struggled with it, and few have lagged behind. The point is, this digital transformation is now taking place across the continent. Investments are being put in place. Of course, the risks that people do not speak of, but I think the challenge that we need to consider is the cybersecurity element. We do not have secure servers on the continent. And so this will become at the forefront of the issues to consider in due course. Cybersecurity is of paramount importance. The other risk I see, which it's both a double-edged sword, a risk and an opportunity, is that there is a risk of alienation or regionalism across the globe. And I can mention this in the arbitration world, where we see in terms of online justice, we have virtual hearings. I had one today, we have it on a weekly basis. The challenge to many across the globe is that you may have parties in Singapore and in the US and in Europe. What time zone would work for everyone? You have now seen the opportunity that hearings that could have taken few days are now stretched over a couple of weeks, because you can only find the window of 4 hours a day where you can have everyone on board. This, I think, will inform the justice systems forward, the choice of arbitrators, not only tech-savvy people, but people that are closer in the time zone to you, so that you don't encounter problems regarding time zone differences. So that is a a risk. The opportunities I see is that law firms on the continent, justice systems, be it court systems or out-of-court dispute settlements, have a golden opportunity now to rise above expectations and deliver the needed justice. Why? Because now you need to invest more into the ICT infrastructure rather than the physical infrastructure, which is very costly and requires a lot of work across the continent. One lesson to be learned, at least from Asia, is that, for example, fixed line phones were not very successful in countries like Nepal, the Philippines, where we've seen proliferation of mobile phones decades ago. Why? Because the infrastructure was too costly. So with mobile phones, it was much easier. The same for the continent in relation to justice systems. It is no longer necessary to build courts that occupy physical space that is large enough. We can have online courts, online platforms capable of sustaining the needed justice and the number of people that would have access to this platform at nominal cost and a fraction of the cost that you need for the normal infrastructure. I'm not suggesting a substitution, but I'm simply saying there will be hybrid practices and platforms that we see. The virtual office system previously across the continent, and I'm not sure whether my colleagues would agree with this, you would measure the credibility of institutions by their physical presence that you can see. If someone was offering online services, you would have a degree of skepticism, lack of credibility, and you would have red flags. Now, this has transformed our perception, created opportunities to rectify the misconceptions about that, bearing in mind the existing risks, of course. So the EADR, or the Alternative Dispute Resolution Promise, and the new service providers that have risen to offer services in a purely online world has increased over the past few weeks. Online dispute resolution is on the rise. We've been involved in that field for about 20 years and everyone thought it was not workable. Suddenly everyone is an expert on something that we see and we do and we've been advocating for many years. So there is rise in e-services, e-products, and e-applications for justice systems. One of the golden opportunities to this is that the continent has been subject to a stigma of corruption over the years. And one of the things that the digital transformation offer is reducing this corruption. Less cash exchanged physically and more online services, possibly the transformation to e-government services will reduce corruption, which is definitely one of the goals to be achieved under Goal 16 of promoting just, peace, and inclusive societies. On the short term, of course, the supply chain has been affected, and this does affect the number of disputes. We see a rise in the number of disputes, the decrease in the ability of people to pay, and so this is not a good measure of economic sustainability or development. But this is on the short term. Why? Because of course we have more than 50% of the industrial machinery, manufacturing and equipment is imported to the continent. The final products are also imported to the continent. So the global supply chains are affected. But on the medium and long term, this gives the continent an edge in terms of utilizing the human resources, the digital transformation, making best use of resources, solidifying the continental free trade agreement, the AfCFTA, as an opportunity or a vehicle for trade. With that in mind, it is completely expected and reasonable to suggest that the continent in the next 5 to 10 years will experience an uprise and an unprecedented hype due to the COVID-19 pandemic in a positive way. So in fact, it is a catalyst. It has opened doors, opened eyes, opened windows, but at the same time, we've got now to take the decision what sectors to invest in, what type of dispute resolution services could be available online, how technology will revolutionize the way we do business and conduct ourselves and disputes. The future of the legal profession, contrary to many who say is uncertain, I say it is very certain. Very certain because there will be a rise in e-lawyers and tech-savvy practitioners. The dominant physical presence and appearance will gradually disappear. Will disappear to the extent that in years' time, people will crave facing face-to-face, meeting face-to-face. And I say that because people need to prepare themselves, equip themselves with that in mind, because there are certain services offered by lawyers that will in time disappear. We already see that in Europe, those engaged in due diligence are no longer the lawyers themselves in the US. There are companies who do it at a fraction of the cost. On the continent, people still do that, but it's going to disappear with the import and utilization of technology. The same thing, law is not just a sector that is immune or alienated from the technological revolution. Even at the medical sector, you find artificial intelligence applications on doing operations, treating people. And we now see applications of predictive justice that will find their way to the continent one way or the other. So we have a choice. Either we stand and enjoy the ride, or we take the lead now when everyone is on par and has been taken by surprise by the COVID-19 crisis. So Africa now has the opportunity to have an equal opportunity to race with developed countries who are also grappling with the current pandemic. And I think the edge that the continent has is that at the time of building its institutions and infrastructure, integrating technology while this is being done is much easier compared to other parts of the world where technology has been not properly integrated and a transformation is needed. I think the online justice systems are the future, whether we like it or not. And being part of it is a wise decision. The question is, we've seen even in Nigeria, beginning of May, criminal courts doing an online hearing and delivering a sentence virtually. So if that is doable, then at the very least in commercial, civil, and every type of dispute, this could be done. Now, arbitration has managed to live up to the expectations of the users by proceeding virtually, and practitioners are trying to adapt to this. Of course, the traditional practice of advocating or prosecuting cases is changing, and normally people are resistant to change and do not like to venture into the unknown. But as the time goes by and the pandemic continues, I think people will be at ease with the new practices that are finding their way into the dispute resolution world, and will inform the choices we make about the transformation and the transmogrification of the options and practices available to users worldwide, including the state court systems as well. I think these are my remarks before we go ahead into the Q&A, unless our co-chairs wish to address any other specific point. I'm very grateful for the opportunity and looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Wahab. Thanks for that. I have a lot of questions on online dispute resolution, especially e-justice, but we'll talk about that during the Q&A session. To move straight to the Q&A session, we're going to find out from the panelists if anyone has got a question, then we'll take it from there, and from there we'll proceed to the participants. So for now, amongst yourselves, does anyone have any questions for any of the speakers? I have a question for you, Professor Mohammed. My question for you is that there's so much reservations by African lawyers on the growth of e-justice. Part of the reservation they have is the loss of jobs, the loss of income. So they're all afraid that if e-justice or online dispute resolution comes into play, how are they going to make the money? Because some of the ways they make the money is through due diligence or through registering companies or small things you and I take for granted in our own field. But for them, it's money. And how would you say? What would you say to them as a specialist? What would you say to them in this new world? As you rightly said, it's inevitable. Whether we like it or not, e-justice is here to stay. Whether we like it, it's going to happen. The matter of time, a matter of when, not a matter of when, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
Well, if you're not part of the steamroller, you're part of the road. But let me say the following. When you look at any field or profession, you will find over the past 100 years, at least, an evolution, a change. Whether it's to the liking of some or not, does not mean that the change is not taking place. I think people need to focus on the future and the projections of how the profession would evolve, and develop their practices accordingly if they want to continue to be competitive and existent. This means, for example, let me tell you, for disputes lawyers who are arbitration specialists, contentious type of disputes, for them, mediation and ADR is a threat, and they're not happy with it.
Yeah.
Does that mean that arbitration has disappeared or mediation is not being used? Not at all. They coexist as options.
Yeah.
To me, the COVID revolution or crisis has given us a window to appreciate that fighting technology is a lost battle. The question now is, how can you harness the technological tools available to serve the needs of the practice? I can accept the challenge that to what extent artificial intelligence, and I'm distinguishing artificial intelligence from ICT, because artificial intelligence is completely different. It's using algorithm actually to create systems that can resolve rather than facilitate. So we can debate the issue to what extent artificial intelligence can or should be integrated for some time at least. But we can't fight the integration of ICT into the dispute resolution field or into the legal field. People will lag behind, and it will become, very costly, not efficient. And clients, they want fast service, proper service with good quality, minimum cost. How can you do that without integrating an element of technology into your practice? So if you want to continue to practice law and be at the apex of those practicing, you have to join the league of people who embrace technology and harness it to your use. This is my immediate answer. Any other answer would not really satisfy people in terms of giving them what would be the future, because this is happening now, not a few years forward.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Moving from the question to Professor Williams, you talked about the bandwidth being low on the continent. How would you address that in the situation where most Africans don't actually have internet? Some is not available. Even those that have it at all, it's quite expensive for them too. So how would you address this issue with regard to e-justice and online dispute resolution going forward?
So that's what I was saying in terms of bridging the gap, that we have to have, or rather African countries have to develop a coherent policy, national policies, and even regional policies actually to address this issue. So we need to liberalize the markets for digital infrastructure. It cannot be purely a private sector affair. If there's any sector where government needs to provide subsidies to make sure that companies can actually come in, meet their costs, and actually provide this as a public good, then this is the sector, because so many things hinge on our digital infrastructure, and not having that reliable, effective digital infrastructure is holding us back in so many ways, as we've been discussing. So I think, we really need our countries to have a strategy that they implement around digital infrastructure, around ensuring that even when they have policies relating to other infrastructure programs like roads or railways or pipelines or things like that, that there is a provision for an optical fiber link, setting up things like internet exchange points, ensuring that there's a market for backbone networks which connect other networks, which connect networks to each other. So a lot can be done, but I think having actually policies that African countries on a regional and a national level that are actually directed at providing this digital infrastructure and providing fiber optic cable and making that accessible across the country is the solution.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. Thank you. Has any other person got any questions? Mohammed, do you have a question?
Can I?
There we go. Yes. Oh, go ahead, Professor. Go ahead, Professor.
No, I just wanted to jump in on that last exchange. Because so can we envisage then, it seems as if the fastest, the quickest route to making e-justice accessible to everyone has to be through mobile technology and solar recharging. So you already have, so where is China in all of this picture? You have all of these tech companies in Africa, but you see companies like Techno that have taken extra steps to make things affordable, to put solar batteries and so on. Are we going to see, are we even going to be resolving disputes in that terrain in the foreseeable future? Because there's massive competition between technology companies that can deliver. Do you see the mobile phone being the instrument that delivers all of this the quickest? I'm just wondering.
Thank you very much, Professor. My immediate answer is that mobile phones will be obsolete. There are companies now working on new technologies, 3-5 components and other, where it will be a chip under your skin. And it's not a sci-fi movie. This is a reality. So look at the mobile phones. You previously had the analog ones, which are the dummy phones. And now the ones they tell you they're subject to security breach because of the high tech and technology. And gradually handheld devices will be transformed into or reduced into a hand device itself. I think that is the future. Not that I'm 100% into that or supportive of this. I'm simply telling you it is happening. The pace at which technology is developed and becoming obsolete is just fascinating. The challenge, of course, is security, because the more, one of the things that have kept at least Africa out of the digital war, let me say that, is that most of the countries are analog in a way. So you can't suffer a cyber attack on the state when you don't have a digital institution in place. But with the integration of technology and the absence of cyber security protocols, this will bring in a new wave of cyber wars onto the continent, leading to denial of service attacks, stuff like that. The ones like we've seen, this is not unprecedented. We know of situations that have happened globally. So countries need to invest not just in the ICT itself, but in the security element and ensuring that the continent has sufficient servers there and the state intervening to offer those services to people instead of just investing in the physical infrastructure.
I was going to add to the issue of the bandwidth, and I'm thinking that as a continent, we need to be more creative. And I think it was a couple of weeks back, I read a report where Rwanda adopted drones in rural areas to kind of provide internet service coverage in the hinterlands. And that was quite dramatic for me, because instead of laying fiber optic cables and all that, what it did was to use drones. So between the hours of, say, 6 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening, the drones are flying over 13 villages and providing internet services. So if internet service infrastructure is a problem, this is another innovative way where we can actually bridge some of these gaps. Just thought I should mention that.
Rwanda actually is the Wakanda of Africa, to use the Black Panther movie thing. I don't know whether you've been to Rwanda. I've been twice. And it's a fascinating country. I'm only Egyptian, so I don't hold any Rwandan citizenship or any. But it's fascinating because the quantum leap that this country has made over a very short period of time is just stellar. Their court system, you know, arbitration, and I know this because part of the work we do in arbitration, arbitration is showcased in Rwanda, not on the basis of speed, like in my country, where it's faster than courts, because that's not the case. The case can take a year from the first degree to the final judgment, less than a year, with automated court systems. They have judges with laptops and everything is integrated there, and they speak both languages, English and French, and it's amazing. But they advocate and promote arbitration on the basis that you have the ability to choose your arbitrator. So Rwanda is very advanced on this in terms of infrastructure, the policy, and what they're doing. So it's fascinating. I think the Rwandan experience should be showcased for other countries. And it's not really a function of being a rich state. That's not the case. It's simply of how you best utilize your resources to serve the needs of society.
Yeah, absolutely. 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 Yeah.
Any other question?
Maybe can I jump in here quickly?
Yes, please.
So maybe this is more the academic in me, and this is a question primarily to Professor Damilola about the SDGs. And I'm wondering whether we could reflect critically on the Sustainable Development Goals, in the sense of, I'm wondering whether the content and structure of the SDGs is to some extent distracting us from another and perhaps more important conversation about whether the international economic structure and the international trade regime is causing severe distributional, sort of negative distributional effects that are harming Africa. And so while the international system is celebrating the SDGs and producing report upon report about the SDGs, the actual conversation we should be having is about the international trade regime and about the international economic regime. And since there are several arbitrators here, about the negative externalities of the international arbitration system. And so perhaps this is to Professor Damilola, but also to other panelists, about whether as Africans, we have become sort of co-opted by this international system and whether we should be having a critical conversation about these structures. Thank you.
Well, you know, thank you very much for the question, Mohammed. I mean, it's a fantastic question, and you know, it reminds me of what I like to say, that whenever you see world leaders and everyone rallying behind an idea, you better look very closely. It's likely that it's a soft law instrument that has no binding effect whatsoever. So it's very, you know, it's a feel-good thing to support it, and that is the feel I get at times when I look at the attitude of many countries to the SDGs. You know, it has become a document that everyone can, just raise up and say, yes, we support the SDGs. Of course, you know, because there is really nothing binding or nothing concrete that will hold you, that, you know, you have to report back to the president and you might get a flogging for for saying what you said. So it's a very convenient document. And I totally agree. The more inconvenient truths are difficult to face, especially in, you know, when you look at the lopsidedness of the world trade system, when you look at the exclusionary nature of international arbitration, when you look at the difficulties Africans and African economies continue to face when it comes to accessing, you know, selling their own products on a competitive basis globally. When you look at the fact that some of the key things that hold the economies of Africa strong are unable to access global markets, you know, then you see that those are the inconvenient truths, that African countries then have to sit back and think of how to adopt, how to address rather, you know. I think the easy or the straightforward way to look at this thing is that international law tries to do a lot, but in the end, the solutions are at home. And African countries have to look inward and think of how to strengthen their own systems. And you will see that a lot of very smart African countries are increasingly moving towards bilateral investment treaties that can allow them to control their own destinies by choosing the right partners that really care about them. I believe that is one way to think of these issues, really, because to say that international law is broken is like saying what everyone already knows. To say that international law can be lopsided at times is nothing new. And to say that the SDGs are very aspirational and that they might not lead to anything concrete without domestic effort and very strategic domestic action is just the universal truth.
I think if I may chime in there, and I'm very grateful for Professor Real's point, and let me put this in context of the Development Goal 16.8, which reads, broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. If you dissect that and critically look into it, it tells you a number of things. First of all, that the institutions of global governance are already in place. You don't have an option. We are simply inviting you to participate with no indication what level of participation at the level of decision making. Are you going to participate in the movie making or just watching the movie in a chair? Are you taking a leading role in directing or writing the script, or just taking a minimal role of appearance in one scene in the movie? All these matters. And then what do you mean by broadening and strengthening? You're moving from a total absence to probably getting you one seat, a couple of seats. I'm not saying that out of simply a subjective view. It is a reality. And the reality tells you is that what has happened and why the sudden interest in Africa in the past few years, because simply it is the last surviving continent with the largest percentage of untapped resources globally. So it's a green field compared to the other continents, the sudden interest. And that's fine. The question is, to what extent are African states going to make the best use of their resources, natural resources, striking good deals? And here I think this touches upon the point Professor Hilal is pointed to, is to what extent do you have the capacity, the ability, and the international, not just stature, but knowledge of negotiating certain deals, be it treaties, be it project agreements, having best practices aligned with the full knowledge of what's happening elsewhere. I think it is extremely important that we realize that Africa's investment in education and the knowledge of Africans has led to a lot of the calamities that we are witnessing today. Education was the last on any list on the continent. And now is the time you need to build a caliber of people that are capable of negotiating properly on behalf of the state. It is a situation now, and Professor Hila would know that, and most of you, where, for example, the international arbitration system relating to investment arbitration is undergoing an attack, is undergoing a transformation, and there is an UNCITRAL working group number 3 looking into that. But when you look at the history of that, why the sudden and immediate attention from the European Commission, from colleagues from other countries, and saying that there is a backlash and the system is dysfunctional and not working their view? It was only when developed countries got sued and when awards and decisions rendered against many of those countries got sued. But African countries and other countries have been sued for a very long period of time, and no one simply had an issue with that. But suddenly, when you realize that the system works both ways, and whether there are credible decisions that could be made against some of the leading nations, that they realized, oh, the system is out of hand. Look at this and look at the same time at the WTO, how the system has become dysfunctional because of for example, the leading state, the US, is doing regarding the appointment of justice and judges on the WTO. So on that point, and I think the discussion needs to be an open and transparent one, is to what extent the existing institutions fulfill the aspirations globally of, and ensures proper representation of all. That's one question. Secondly, if the institutions are fine, but require, let's say, systemic overhauling or reconsideration of the functions and the governance, then to what extent not just African states, African, Latin American, Asian states, not the forefront, participate in this global discourse? This, I think, touches upon what Professor Hillel has mentioned, but this goes to the fundamental point, to what extent international law and international relations would permit this type of discussion.
This is amazing. I'm so sorry. Can I say something very quickly? No, I mean, this is fascinating. And the point that you both have made, I think actually also all three recent speakers made, our destiny is in our hands. And unless, the idea that we don't have that much agency, or that, we're so powerless, which some people will advance, the arguments that will be advanced in that way no longer holds water. If we own our own natural resources, we should be able to negotiate on our terms what happens to those resources. And so, is it a question of incapacity to negotiate properly, or is it even the fact that the basic conversations about terms? I mean, with some of our colleagues, some of us belong in universities. As an international vice president, if I want to sign an agreement with another university partner, 5 out of 10 times, I get away with an MOU that says the jurisdiction, if there's any dispute, is the United Kingdom. Interestingly, the other 5 out of 10 times, you have partners who say no. And this will come from some of our Chinese partners. It might come from some of our partners in parts of Asia that would say, no, we need to really consider this, and then our legal offices will go back and forth. I think it's up to us to even say it on our terms, our courts. I rarely see African institutions dictate their terms. Some countries, of course, are exceptions, amongst the 54 or so countries. Of course, you'd find Rwanda being an exception, you'd find Egypt, you'd find Mauritius, you'd find South Africa. The fact that I'm even counting like that shows that these are exceptions. So maybe there's need for a rethink. And when you think of either knowledge production or you think of legal systems, you find parts of Asia, you find countries emerge with their own knowledge systems. And we have knowledge systems that we hardly ever project and say to people, these are the terms on which we'll come. So therefore you have a global leadership infrastructure that is failing. It is extremely weak. And we have not even tried to benefit from it yet, from that weakness, by redesigning and saying these are the terms on which we'll join. And I think, and I want to go with Professor Wahab here, that there's a moment of opportunity presented by COVID across the board. If not for COVID, we would not even have seen the extent of the weakness of the global leadership infrastructure. That we have a UN Security Council that was silent all that time on questions of what could have been of global benefit. And if not for World Health Organization and others, the UN was silent when it came to trying to convene the whole world in ways that it wasn't so silent when it was Ebola or HIV/AIDS for that matter. So I see this as a moment of opportunity for us to really put the terms, at least, we should be sitting at the table on fairly equal terms when it comes to our own destinies. I see it as a major opportunity, really.
quickly
fully
add.
agree with you, and
No.
I would add even that it goes beyond opportunity to actually survival, not in my lifetime, but the next wave of scarcity. Look, the 29th of June 2019 marked the first time where the world has depleted its annual resources over half a year. Imagine the continent has water resources, has food resources. In time, this will be the golden products where everyone is looking for. So it's a question of survival in years as well.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay. I was going to add, in nowadays, one thing that is critical and is leadership. What we have in Africa, 7 times out of 10, are accidental leaders. Not, how would I put it, not purposeful leadership, planned purposeful leadership. What we have is accidental leadership. And so if it's accidental leadership, the political will to actually push for some of these changes is not there. So what you see is a gap in leadership. And if we address that from a unit country point of view, address the leadership gaps first, and then as a block, we can then begin to do more. But what you see is that everybody is going their way because diverse interest in accidental leadership means that there's no political will to even drive some of these changes we're talking about. So we can have this conversation all we want, but if there's no political will based on practical leadership to see that these changes are actually done, we're not going to get anywhere. So
because I think we're in the wrong places.
Yeah, we as a people, so people like the academicians like yourselves and everyone must begin to get interested in the way the countries are being run. Must begin to ask questions of the political class and become part of the political class to be able to push some of these changes. I use Nigeria as an example. Some of the biggest changes we've seen in agriculture was pushed by the gentleman who is now chairman of Additional. Okonjo-Iweala did a bit. If Moigwe has done a bit in FRA. So some of these changes we've seen in Nigeria as a country has been pushed by people like yourselves, like academicians who have thought about it. There has to be purposeful leadership in organs. And so if we did not look at that sphere, then we might still be, backing the wrong horse. Because in all the conversation, we must actually look at that political aspect of purposeful leadership.
I agree with you, Ose, but I think for me, apart from leadership, we also have a problem with followership. Because even if you have leaders that cannot, rise to the occasion, what do the followers do? What do our citizens do? They look. They literally don't participate. They're not active citizens. They don't demand better from their leaders. So even if the leaders were clueless and are not purposeful, are not visionary, then the citizens themselves don't act as if they have skin in the game. They don't act as if, it's that they have a right to demand better. So I think even that is a problem, because in other countries where you have leaders who have failed, the citizens rise up against them and they boot them out either violently with or at the polls. But we don't do that. We bring back the same set of people every single time. They change name, but they're actually the same person that we've had. So it's not just the leaders; it's the followers as well that are failing.
May I suggest that it's important that we rethink our concept of leadership? I think the discussion, and it's based on, what can I say, an unconscionable bias. We're thinking of leaders as individuals. I think we need to move from individual subjective views to institutions. If you have institutions in place and you have proper education for people, this will ultimately lead in a situation where you have proper leaders and followers in a way. But again, it's a work in progress and nothing is done overnight. But I think what African governments could start doing is proper investment in research, development, education, and health. And then you pick it up and you probably, you would have better systems in place.
No, it's true. I think some of the institutions, I have to say that I totally agree. I mean, as someone who also combines leadership studies with where I'm at, there's a massive amount of literature. And you're right. When you see leadership as relationship, the idea that, you know, when we see leadership as collaborative social action, it requires, you know, full collaboration between leaders and followers, for want of a better word, I use that. Where I agree with Sophie about followership is this, is that if you don't take note of where the energy is at, of whose ideas and ambitions are shaping something, and all we focus on our institutions, which, you know, in many of our own countries, I can count at least 5 African countries where, if you look at policing, for example, we still have the colonial acts. So if those institutions were not created for us, it means that the energy has to come from outside of the institutions that were created to subjugate in the first instance. And so there's a lot of work to be done, because for those institutions to be strong enough, they have to represent the collective will. One of our fellows at the African Leadership Center, to make the point about followership, said, if we don't change the way we follow, they will not change the way they lead. And I think it's about looking at where the energy is at. And my worry sometimes is that we have over-invested in institutions that don't represent the whole, but actually at the end of the day represent, even at the global level, this is what's happening with the UN Security Council, represents a small group, you know, a select few. And therefore, what people do is opt out of those institutions at the end of the day. But if we see leadership as a relationship between those who are asserting influence and an exchange of influence actually between those who have the situation in common, we begin to change the direction. This overwhelming focus on individuals who do not actually even serve the benefits of the majority, I think is the canker that we need to really you know, reinvent differently in Africa.
Thanks for that. Thank you. Any questions from the participants? We had one which has been answered.
I don't see anything in Q&A.
No, I can't see it. Okay, then it's 8 o'clock, it's 6 o'clock. It brings us to the end of this session. On behalf of Mohammed and I want to say thank you very much for all the speakers. We are really grateful for the wonderful, insightful, and informative presentation. All I want to say to you is thank you and thank you and thank you.